Professor Barry Schwartz perfectly combines economics and psychology. He maintains the stance that we need to remoralize our lives. His main belief is that infinite choices are paralyzing and exhaustive for the human psyche. This, in turn, contributes to self-blame and pity as we place exceedingly high expectations on ourselves. In his previous research, he has investigated free market thinking on consumerism, society, and science. He's a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, as a visiting lecturer, and he teaches social theory and action at Swarthmore College. With 8 books, 16 million views on his TED Talks, and years of experience under his belt, Professor Schwartz is here today to speak to us about what he titles his topic as Some Important Things Economics Can Learn from Psychology. I can already tell that this is going to be one of the most eye-opening speeches of the event, and I cannot wait to hear all he has to say. Please help me give a warm welcome to Professor Barry Schwartz. We are delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really honored to be among you. I never thought I would ever be asked to give a talk to an audience of economists because I've never studied economics. And in my experience, when I give talks or write things that economists happen to read, their reaction to hearing that I've never studied economics is, well, that's obvious. Because if you'd studied economics, you couldn't possibly be making the kinds of mistakes you make in characterizing what we do. So I didn't expect this, and I'm thrilled and delighted to be talking to you. Let's see if the slides actually work. Whoop. Okay. So let me go back. Some things economics can learn from psychology. That's what I'm going to talk to you about. And I know that that all of the evidence that has been accumulating in psychology, largely stimulated by the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, also Richard Thaler, has had over the last 30 years or so started to have a real impact on how economists think and the kind of work that economists do. And this field that has exploded, this field called behavioral economics, is an indication that, although it wasn't true in the early days, it is now true that economists know that there's a lot to be learned from psychology. I'm not going to rehearse any of that work, which I assume that most of you are already familiar with. Instead, I'm going to focus in this very brief talk on 2 specific ideas that I have done some work on and done some thinking about that I think may be particularly relevant now. And those ideas are, on the one hand, to talk about the value of efficiency, and second, to talk about the value of utility maximization as an aspiration. I will take these 2 topics up in turn. And what I'll suggest is the following. Efficiency is good, but there can be too much of a good thing. There can be too much efficiency. And with respect to utility maximization, I'll suggest to you that utility maximizing as a goal is something of a fool's errand, because it is literally impossible to maximize utility in most of the situations that we encounter in our daily lives. My first point about efficiency suggests that the relation between efficiency and welfare, well-being, is non-monotonic, is a kind of inverted U. The second point revolves around the idea on utility maximization, revolves around the idea that attaching probabilities to outcomes is mostly a fantasy. And what that means is that utility calculation is mostly a fantasy. If utility maximization is a fiction, then the question we need to be asking is, what is the goal we should be pursuing, since the goal of utility maximization is not achievable? So that's the plan. This will be a somewhat skeletal presentation since we don't have a lot of time. And I look forward to hearing your comments and questions when I finish. So let's talk about efficiency. The modern world is certainly characterized by the worship of efficiency. Use less to produce more. Same-day delivery. Multitask. Do more than one thing at a time. Efficiency is a good thing. Inefficiency is wasteful. Economics teaches us that increased efficiency is really the only way that a society's standard of living improves. If your company raises your pay without becoming more efficient, it will have to raise its prices in order to pay you. And if all companies raise their prices to allow for higher wages, we end up just running in place with our higher wages exactly matched by the higher prices of the things that we buy. It is only if your company and other companies find a way to pay you more without having to charge more that your living standard and everybody else's living standard will go up. So if we want to make material progress, we have to become more efficient. Streamline supply chains, just-in-time delivery of materials, no slack in the workforce, all combine to create an engine of efficiency. No assets sit idle. Every dollar spent is productive, and our lives as consumers just get better and better and better. And as this is true in the world of consumer goods, so it is in the world of finance. Hard as it is to imagine, societies didn't always have money. Niall Ferguson wrote a book, here's a cover of it on the slide, called The Ascent of Money, that discusses the invention of money and how it went a long way toward reducing friction, reducing inefficiency in commercial transactions. With money, it was no longer necessary for the potato farmer to bring sacks of potatoes to the marketplace to trade for eggs and milk. Money was a medium of exchange that greatly reduced the commercial coefficient of drag. Arguably, much that has happened in the financial world over the last 200 years can be seen as a continuation of the revolution in efficiency that was begun by money. Take credit, for example. Credit meant that you could go shopping for eggs and milk in the marketplace without even having the money, without even having sold your potatoes. The farmer could promise to pay at a later date after the potato harvest. And the farmer didn't have to save up the surplus for many years of good crops before expanding the amount of land under cultivation. It was possible to get the land now with credit and pay for it over time, in part with the proceeds from the newly cultivated acres. More recently, financial markets have been all about efficiency. Like point masses moving in frictionless vacuums, financial transactions are so far removed from the material entities that underlay them that transactions can occur with lightning speed, with nothing to slow them down. The creation of options markets, for example, means that you don't even have to go to the trouble of buying a stock that you're going to be selling soon anyway. You can just promise to buy it and then sell it at a price and a date specified by the option contract. And then you can trade the option rather than trading the underlying stock. The writer Michael Lewis describes what may be the absolute pinnacle of financial efficiency in this book called Flash Boys, which describes traders in the New York metropolitan area near the New York Stock Exchange, where the most important strategic decision they had was to figure out where to locate themselves so that their electronic trade orders could reach the market milliseconds faster than the trade orders of their competitors. The whole game was being the first to issue the sell or the buy order. Each of these kinds of developments and many others have made it easier to do your business without wasted time and energy, without friction. And that, as I said before, is obviously good. But the financial crisis of now 12 or 13 years ago suggested that maybe there could be too much of a good thing. If loans had not been securitized, bankers might have taken the time to assess the creditworthiness of each loan applicant. So whereas some efficiency is good, more efficiency may not be better. There may be too much of a good thing. With Adam Grant, about a decade ago, I wrote a paper on what we call the ubiquitous inverted U. And what we suggested in that paper is that this too much of a good thing phenomenon may actually be quite general. So, for example, some motivation produces excellent performance. Too much motivation produces choking. Some working together as a group produces cohesion and enhances productivity. Too much of it leads to staleness. Some empathy enables you to understand what another person's going through. Too much may prevent you from saying and doing hard things that need to be said and done. Some choice is liberating. Too much choice is paralyzing. And I wrote a whole book about that specific phenomenon. So finding the right amount of motivation and collaboration and empathy and choice and many other aspects of life, finding what Aristotle, the ancient philosopher Aristotle, called the mean, is the real challenge that we face, both as individuals and as a society. The poet William Blake said 200 years ago, perhaps the only way to figure out how much is enough is by experiencing too much. And what I'm suggesting to you is that in connection with efficiency, we have in recent years been experiencing too much. The financial crisis taught at least some of us that we'd become too efficient. What about COVID? As the pandemic fades away, or effective vaccines ease the threat, attention will, indeed already has, turned to the lack of preparation that the pandemic revealed almost everywhere in the world. Attention will be paid, as it should be, to the stockpiling of key supplies and machines, to hospital capacity, to the robustness of supply chains, and stuff like that. And no doubt, when the dust settles, we will be readier for the next pandemic than we were for this one, at least until we forget the lessons of this one. And so thinking about stockpiles and supply chains will be and is important. But it would be a missed opportunity, I think, if the lessons that the pandemic taught are applied only in the limited domain of disease preparedness. Arguably, it is inefficient, that is to say, profit robbing, to have warehouses full of goods that may not be needed. The money that is spent on masks and gowns that gather dust in some warehouse could instead be put to productive use in the marketplace. It's inefficient to have more people employed than you need under ordinary circumstances. It's inefficient to make everything that goes into your product yourself, rather than relying on some sort of international supply chain that exploits what economists call comparative advantage. And since the growth of our own standard of living depends, as I said a few minutes ago, on efficiency, every inefficient thing we do takes a bite out of potential consumption. Are we willing to live less well now by building into production and storage a set of hedges against an uncertain future? I don't know the answer to that. I think if by now you mean tomorrow, maybe we are willing. If by now you mean 10 years from now, when this is to some degree forgotten, then I'm not so sure. But it's kind of interesting. There are two lovely examples of the costs and the benefits of inefficiency. Some years ago, Toyota model of efficient production had a catastrophe. The great earthquake in Japan destroyed a key source of a part that went into many of Toyota's automobiles. And with the factory destroyed, Toyota was unable to produce the number of cars that were required to meet demand. They learned a lesson from this. They learned a lesson from taking advantage of comparative advantage, and they now have much more redundancy in their supply chain than they had before. And very recently, Tesla, as I'm sure most of you know, there's a huge shortage of chips that go into every imaginable device these days, but certainly go into cars. And this has really hampered automobile production by most car manufacturers. Tesla, however, because they're so software savvy, has adopted a procedure where they will buy whatever chips are available on the market and use their in-house programmers to modify the code. And so Tesla has a kind of in-house flexibility when supply chain problems arise that the traditional automobile manufacturers don't have. And the result is that even though Tesla's as high tech as you can get when it comes to automobiles, it seems to be less affected by the supply chain, digital supply chain problem than all of its competition. And so the story on efficiency is that efficiency is good, but there can be too much of a good thing. How about uncertainty and maximizing utility? In the light of what I just said, you can think of efficiency as a kind of insurance policy. Think about how inefficient insurance is. Every year that you don't get into an automobile accident, you've wasted your car insurance premium. Every year your house doesn't burn down, you've wasted your homeowner's insurance. Every year you're healthy, you've wasted your health insurance. Every year you don't die, you've wasted your life insurance. And all this waste adds up. You could be living a much, much better life without all these insurance premiums to pay. What does insurance buy us? Well, one way to think about insurance is that it enables us to be resilient against shocks that befall us from a world that is radically uncertain. And what I want to suggest to you is that the world is radically uncertain. Students of risk like Frank Knight a century ago and Daniel Ellsberg a half century ago have distinguished between risk on the one hand between uncertainty that is probabilistic and uncertainty that is not. And to make this distinction clear, let me remind you of what's come to be known as the Ellsberg paradox. If you look at the urn on the left, urn A, it has 50 red balls and 50 blue balls. If you reach in and pick out a ball with your eyes closed and you pick out a red one, you get $10. If you pick out a blue one, you get nothing. Contrast that with the second urn. Also has 100 balls, red and blue, but you don't know how many of each. The payoffs are exactly the same. Pick a red ball, you get $10. Pick a blue ball, you get nothing. In the case of urn A, we can calculate the expected value for somebody picking a ball. Expected value with each pick is $5. But what about the second urn? The probability of winning and thus the expected value are unknown, since the composition of the balls in the urn is unknown. In discussing these two types of urns, Ellsberg made a distinction between risk, described by urn A, and uncertainty, described by urn B. Risk was between risk and ambiguity. Risk is probabilistic, ambiguity is not. Knight used the terms risk and uncertainty. With collaborators with whom I've written about this problem, I've used the distinction between probabilistic uncertainty, earn A, on the one hand, and radical uncertainty, earn B, on the other. And a collaborator of mine, Jacob Ben Haim, has written extensively on the problem of making rational decisions, making good decisions in the face of a radically uncertain world. This book, Information Gap Decision Making, is a very formal, very difficult, and very intelligent attempt to deal with this issue. And one of the things that he suggests is that when we're operating in a radically uncertain world, the question we should be asking is not what option optimizes at my expected value, my expected utility, but rather what option will provide a good enough result under the widest set of possible future states of the world. In a radically uncertain world, we can't even calculate an expected value. A more recent book by Kay and King, titled Radical Uncertainty, makes the same point. This book was came out just last year. What should we do in the face of radical uncertainty? Instead of asking ourselves which option will give the best results, we should be asking which option will give us good enough results under the widest set of future states of the world. Instead of trying to maximize return on investment in our retirement account, we should be setting a financial goal and then choosing investments that will allow us to achieve that goal under a wide set of future financial circumstances. Instead of looking for the best job, we should be looking for a job that will be good enough, satisfying enough, as coworkers and managers come and go and the future economy gyrates. Instead of choosing the best university to go to, we should be choosing a university that will be good enough, even with an obnoxious roommate and a really boring economics professor. The term that I've used, borrowing from the psychologist economist Herbert Simon, is satisficing. Satisficing is looking for good enough. Maximizing is looking for the best. And satisficing with an eye toward that acknowledges the radically uncertain future that we face might be called robust satisficing. And what you do as a, quote, robust satisficer is you ask, what alternative will give a good enough result under the widest set of future states of the world? In business or investing, it's not what maximizes return, but what produces a good enough return under the widest set of future states. In choosing a university or a job, it's not what's the best X, but what X will be good enough under the widest set of future circumstances. The first task then, if you have this view, is to figure out for yourself what kind of an outcome would be a good enough outcome. And then you organize your decision-making so that it will be as robust as possible to a very much uncertain future. And there's an important point that I want to emphasize here. When Simon first discussed satisficing, people thought of it as, sort of a suboptimal result that is okay for stupid people. People who lack the cognitive or psychological resources to do the difficult calculations that would enable them to maximize. Satisficing is, sort of the best that stupid people can do. I want to suggest that satisficing is normatively correct. It isn't a sort of second best for dummies. It's normatively the right thing to do. Because calculating expected values, as I said in the introduction, is often a fantasy. You can't maximize. And so the normatively correct thing to do, the rational thing to do, is to satisfice. And if people understood that, It might remove barriers to satisficing in some people who think that to satisfice is to settle, and they are or should be capable of better than that. Satisficing is a kind of insurance. Insurance against financial meltdowns, insurance against global pandemics, insurance against nasty bosses, boring teachers, and obnoxious roommates. Now, insurance may seem stodgy. Since I can't see any of you, I don't know how old you are, but I'm assuming you're way younger than I am. Insurance is stodgy. It's like a man who wears a belt and suspenders. And it seems especially stodgy in a world that encourages us to move fast and break things. Perhaps we don't need both a belt and suspenders. But what happens when we have neither? Just when we're called upon to run away from danger, we trip as our pants gather around our ankles. Insurance provides us with some security against an uncertain future. When life seems to be business as usual, we can get complacent about the importance of insurance, of security, but we shouldn't. I think the deep flaw revealed in our lack of readiness for the economic meltdown of 2008-2009 and the pandemic that we're still in the midst of is in part a manifestation of a kind of unbridled pursuit of efficiency and a neglect of security. Things need not be this way. We could work to put a little friction back into our lives. We could work to rekindle social norms that slow things down. For example, if people thought about their homes less as investments and more as places to live, full of the friction of kids and dogs and friends and neighbors and community organizations, there might well be less speculation with an eye toward house flipping and thus fewer housing bubbles. And if companies felt the friction of being caretakers of their communities, they might look differently at the streamlining of operations by eliminating jobs or lowering production costs by moving their operations offshore. In an uncertain world, concern for security is essential, and adding friction can add security. We would all like a car that gets 100 miles to a gallon. The forces of friction that slow us down are an expensive annoyance. But when we're driving a car, we know where we're going and we're in control. Fast is good, though even here, a little bit of friction can forestall disaster when we encounter an icy road. Driving is perilous enough, but life is not nearly as predictable as driving. We don't always know where we're going. We're not always in control. A little something to slow us down in the uncertain world we inhabit may be a lifesaver. Building friction into the system is building resilience into the system, and it may be a kind of insurance policy against catastrophe. So let me sort of summarize. Almost a century ago, a distinguished biologist named Jacob von Uexküll observing how evolution shaped organisms so that their abilities were precisely attuned to their survival, remarked that, quote, security is more important than wealth. What he meant by this is that, like a human being hiking in a forest marvels at the visual majesty of nature, the varied sounds, the rich smells of the forest, a hike in the midst of natural beauty is an incredibly enriching experience. A squirrel foraging in the same forest doesn't have the wealth of experience that people do. There's a lot going on in the woods that the squirrel doesn't notice. What the squirrel does have is the security that it will notice what matters most. Evolution, according to von Uexküll, trades a wealthy sensory system that can notice many things for a secure sensory system that is highly constrained and is oblivious to many things, but won't miss the things that matter. There's redundancy of design that produces a kind of robustness of both perception and action when it comes to matters of survival. And this redundancy helps organisms recognize food, find mates, avoid predators, and supplies them with a very small set of activities that are appropriate for obtaining what they truly need. Now, for squirrels, the security-wealth trade-off is built into their biology. Squirrels aren't choosing security over wealth. For people, such trade-offs don't come from biology. They come from culture. Some cultures have constraints in oppressive abundance, while our consumer culture, our Western affluent society's consumer culture, has striven for decades to jettison as many of those constraints as it possibly can. Psychologist Michelle Gelfand, in this book, has shown how societies differ in making the security and wealth, or the constraint and freedom, or what the polls that she uses is tight and loose trade-off. The point is that there is a trade-off between security and wealth, or freedom and constraint. And different societies differ in how they make the trade-off. And she has studied this tight, loose security, freedom trade-off across different societies, and asked how where you stand on this continuum affects your well-being, the well-being of your citizens. And here's what she's found. Measuring reported happiness, dysthymia, which is just sort of generally like depression, suicidality, but also cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and life expectancy. Here's what she's found. Across different countries, on the x-axis is how tight or loose a society is. On the y-axis is this global measure of well-being. And what she finds is that the best fitting descriptor of the relation between tightness and looseness on the one hand and well-being on the other is an inverted U. If you're too tight, life sucks. If you're too loose, life is unmanageable and unpredictable. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle of this tight, loose continuum, at least with respect to the well-being of your citizens. And so this is another instance of what Adam Grant and I referred to as the ubiquitous inverted U. When things are going well, we radically underestimate how uncertain the world is, and we similarly overestimate our ability to control the things that matter. Dramatic events like the financial meltdown a decade ago and the pandemic now remind us, or should remind us, of how important security against an uncertain future can be. But then events level out and we quickly forget the lesson that we seem to have learned during the crisis. Is it possible to learn lessons about the importance of robustness and resilience at moments of great crisis and uncertainty, and then use them to reshape our institutions so that even when we forget the crucial lessons that moments of crisis provide, our institutions will remember them with structures and practices in place that ensure us against disaster? I wish I knew the answer to that question. I hope the answer to that question is yes. And so in this final slide, here's a parent fish talking to its baby, and the caption reads, "You can be anything you want to be, no limits." And we're supposed to laugh at the irony here because it's such an impoverished world that this fish is in. What do you mean no limits? This fishbowl is nothing but limits. And that was my first reaction when I saw this cartoon some years ago. But the more I thought about it, the more I came to believe that we all need a fishbowl. You shatter this fishbowl and create unlimited freedom, and that's the end of the fish. It's disaster. Most of the things that can happen to the fish in this world are bad. The security of the fishbowl protects the fish from all kinds of dangers, many of them lethal. And so what I came to see in this cartoon is that we all need a fishbowl. And the question, the challenging question, is for human beings, what needs to be in the fishbowl so that we can live rich and meaningful lives while still being protected against the uncertainties of an unpredictable, the harsh uncertainties of an unpredictable world. We clearly need more in our fishbowl than the fish need in theirs. But the challenge is to figure out how you build fishbowls that have enough so that we can live good lives, but not so much that we never know what tomorrow will bring. And so this, I think, is an important lesson to be learned, both from the financial crisis of, as I say, a decade ago, and from the crisis that we're going through now. And it really makes the notion of maximizing seem foolish and ill-considered. So thank you very much. I am eager to hear your questions. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for that. That was very insightful. We have quite a few questions coming through.
Good.
The first one is, with regards to having too much of a thing can be harmful. Do you think that we are in danger of encountering that with regards to tech advancements?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's merely quantitative. I got to say, the idea that 50 years from now, people will look back on this era and applaud something like Twitter sends chills down my spine. If the best we can do with all of our intelligence and wealth is create Twitter and Facebook, this is an extraordinary indication of misplaced resources, intelligence, and energy. So I don't think there's a too muchness problem. The question is, how do you direct the technology? And I think here too, there, at least in the Western world, the notion that there's anyone who's going to direct it just as anathema. You let smart people do whatever they think is interesting or whiz bang or will make them a lot of money. And then the competitive market will sort out the junk from the value, and we'll all end up living better lives. I think we have pretty good evidence at this point that that's not going to happen without some guidance from somewhere.
Thank you. And do you think that there are certain heuristics that help us in finding the perfect amount, that sweet spot you were talking about earlier?
If only. I have made this point specifically in connection with choice, since I've spent 20 years talking about that. And people ask me, what's the right amount of choice to have? And my answer is, that's a great question, but there's no answer to it. Individuals differ in how much choice is the right amount. And in addition, within an individual, there's differences from one domain to another. I don't want a choice among 200 kinds of breakfast cereal, but I might not mind a choice among 200 books to read. And so it's really very difficult to sort of legislate what the right amount of choice is and then impose it so that people's lives are less chaotic and they can make better choices. We need to learn that for ourselves. What I will say, especially to people who imagine themselves not in academic careers, but in careers in the commercial world, that what's the right amount to offer my customers is a much harder question to ask than simply assuming that if some choice is good, more will be better. It takes a lot of work, careful work, to figure out what the sweet spot is for the particular product or service you're offering to the particular clientele you're offering it to. And I'm afraid there's no substitute for doing the research.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, how do you see the future of behavioral economics developing?
Well, what I've been incredibly impressed with the enthusiasm and imaginativeness with which young people in the field are taking principles that come out of the laboratory and then implementing in applied settings practices that are designed to improve the economic well-being of the relevant population. And there are a couple of important lessons here. One is you can't assume you know what the effect of an intervention will be. You have to try it. And the other is that what look like small effects in the laboratory, not worth taking the trouble to pursue, a 3% change, it's barely worth reporting. When you actually take those effects and apply them in the world, that 3% change can be life transforming for thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of people. And so when we have this sense that what we try to figure out in the lab is actually going to be applied at scale in the world, we should take enormous satisfaction from small effects because the multipliers are gigantic. So I'm incredibly impressed with what people have done in applying a handful of principles that have come out of the laboratory to really deeply important social problems of inequality and inadequate, below subsistence standards of living throughout the world. I'm very optimistic that this can be world changing. Here's the main problem. The main problem, and I encountered this some years ago when giving a talk to representatives of the Dutch government, is that there is this obstacle, this ideological obstacle, which is that interventions seem like they are manipulating people and controlling them. And the highest good we have is freedom. And so what gives us the right to impose something on other people rather than having them elected voluntarily? And it's very difficult to convince people that there's really no neutral way to present or construct any policy. Whatever your policy is, you're pushing people in one direction or the other. And the best you can do is try to make it easy for people to be pushed in directions that are good for them and harder for them to be pushed in directions that are bad for them. But you have to get over this notion that there can be absolute freedom of choice and the options for living that people face are completely neutral, and we just get to pick what we want to put into our particular market basket. So I think there will be government resistance often to policy interventions that can have a big positive impact on the citizenry, and we need to figure out good ways to educate people in power so that their knee-jerk objections to a lot of these interventions fade away. Long answer, sorry.
No, that was a perfect answer. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Our next question is, does satisficing and looking for the good enough hurt disruptive innovation? Can the ambiguous environment still help us provide the best solutions?
Well, so that's also a great question. I think the answer to that might be yes, that if you're satisfied with good enough, you're less likely to break through barriers, right? The only time you're going to break through a barrier is when you can't find good enough. And being satisfied with what we've got means we're not looking around for what doesn't seem to be there. That's okay. I think that's true. The question is whether we all need to be doing that all the time in our lives. The people who developed the Google search engine wanted to do something unimaginably transformative. We could all go to the library and look at an encyclopedia. They said, no, we can do better than that. And they changed the world. Now, for all I know, they were miserable because they could never come up with a search engine that was as good as the one that they envisioned in their heads. There were glitches and various other problems. So they were beating themselves up and working 20 hours a day. I guess they ended up okay, didn't they, the founders of Google? But it might have been incredibly frustrating. These were really smart people. They could have had great lives without trying to provide all the world's information to all the world's people at the click of a mouse. So they might have suffered a little bit in the process, and the rest of us benefited. That's fine. We don't all need to go through life, every aspect of life, thinking that the objective is to produce the next Google. That's just not the way to live a life. It's a recipe for misery, wasted effort, and dissatisfaction, even with lives that should be quite satisfying. But there's no question that if everybody was satisfied with good enough, the world would make progress much more slowly.
So how would you know whether you're supposed to go in that direction of searching for more, or whether you should just be satisfied with good
Right.
enough?
So what Herb Simon said when he initially introduced this notion of satisficing is that the world teaches us. So I'm satisfied having Cheerios for breakfast every morning. I spend a weekend at a friend's house. They don't have Cheerios. So I have whatever cereal they have, and I discover, oh, that's even better than Cheerios. And now my standard for what counts as a good enough cereal has gone up because I have been forced to encounter something that it turns out is better. So it's okay to go through life looking for and being satisfied with good enough, as long as your eyes are open so that you notice when better smacks you in the face. And when that happens, your standard of what counts as good enough goes up. And that can keep happening. So what Simon's point was is that in the limit, people who are looking for good enough move toward the best. They do it sort of by accident as the world confronts them with options that are better than the ones that they had previously been satisfied with. The drawback to that, it should be said, is that you end up potentially never being satisfied because you know that somewhere out there, there's a breakfast cereal that's better than the one that you eat every morning. And then you're always sort of restlessly looking for the perfect breakfast cereal. So the trick is to take advantage of accidental improvements in your life without being slavishly devoted to always deliberately finding those improvements in your life.
I see. So we're inching closer to maximizing, but we're not.
That's right. Inch by inch. Breakfast by breakfast, job by job, romantic partner by romantic partner. We keep on inching toward the perfect breakfast cereal and the perfect job and the perfect romantic partner. That's the model. Although I don't think you should switch romantic partners quite as frequently as you should switch breakfast cereals.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, do you think people maximize instead of satisfy because they often misinterpret external signals and constraints?
Well, surely people do misinterpret external signals and constraints, but that was one of the points I was trying to make in one of my slides. I also think that people, when I talk about satisficing, for example, what people hear is settling for good enough. In my experience, the word settle is not a neutral descriptor. The word settle is evaluative and it's evaluated negatively. She settled for that restaurant when there were so many better restaurants available, right? Settling is bad. And so the point I made about satisficing being normative, not merely the best we can do as stupid creatures, it was partly designed to try to overcome the notion that settling is giving up, is shooting too low, is aspiring for less than we ought to be aspiring. And in that sense, I don't doubt that the signals that we get from the environment are precisely that you should never be satisfied with good enough. In fact, the signals we get from the environment is that we should never be satisfied, full stop. And that's really, really bad for us. And I think wasteful of society's resources. And it contributes, it exacerbates the inequality problem that we are already facing all over the world. But those are the signals that you get, especially if you grow up in a privileged part of a privileged society. Settling is always selling yourself short. And that's a terrible idea, I believe.
So do you think it's those influences that makes it so difficult for us to understand the difference between settling and satisfying or satisficing?
Yes, I do. I think you say I say satisfice, and people hear settle. And whatever satisficing might mean, settling is bad, right? I have spent my entire childhood being taught by my parents and my teachers never to settle for second best, right? Where the Olympics are just starting now, right? And what Olympic athlete says, "Oh, I hope I get a bronze"? It's like, you're not allowed to be on the Olympic team if you're hoping you get a bronze. Only the gold will do. Terrible, terrible way to live a life. I think, no matter how much you achieve, you're always feeling like a failure.
I see. Moving on from that topic, someone asked, what special tools does a 21st century behavioral economist need in this digitalized world?
Well, you need to know what the deep basic principles are that are arising from research in behavioral economics. I think you need to be very, very clever about taking advantage of technology to make sort of design interventions that are actually feasible in a world where material resources are reasonably scarce. And again, one of the amazing things that I would never have anticipated, the power of the cell phone. You don't need this enormous infrastructure wiring, thousands of miles of wire to bring people into the modern world. Cell towers can, especially considering how smart the phones are, can do an enormous amount. And so something that looks like a 50-year project can actually be a 5-year project. And so asking how you can take advantage of what the technology makes possible and apply it in domains that it wasn't created for, right? This technology of smartphones was not made for people living on $2 a day. It was made for people like us who can afford to pay exorbitant amounts for this little computer that we carry around in our pockets. But you, as somebody with an interest in intervening to improve welfare somewhere, can take advantage of this rich people's toy and ask how can it be used to improve the lives of not so rich people. So I would say know what's going on in the lab and be very, very attuned to the implementation possibilities that technology affords us.
Thank you for that. The next question is one I was also quite curious about. Do you think the act of searching for security simply makes us more insecure, which makes us value wealth more? I know in your slides you said that we value security more than wealth, but do you think that it's this fight for security that's making us value the wealth?
Well, that of course is a very challenging and complicated question. But one of the things I try to suggest is that we may forget the insecurity that the pandemic or 10 years ago the financial crisis induced. So the trick, as we forget and go back to living the way we had been, is for there to be social institutions in place that don't forget. And it seems to me that the way to translate that claim I made into a response to this question is, if you live in a society where you are on your own, where there is nothing in the society that will catch you if you fall, then indeed the only insurance policy you have is to accumulate more and more wealth. You're going to have to pay for your health care. You're going to have to pay for your housing. You're going to have to pay for your utilities, for your food, for your children's education. It's all on you. Under those conditions, how much is enough? The answer is no matter how much you have, it may not be enough. If, however, institutions within society take a lot of that uncertainty away by telling you, when the worst happens, we're there. We're there to catch you. You don't have to worry about getting your illnesses treated. You don't have to worry about getting your children educated. You just have to worry about, earning a livelihood sort of at the margins. When you retire, there's a national pension plan that will take care of you. Then it seems to me it's a lot easier to adopt a satisficing approach, because you know that there's a net to catch you. And even if you forget what it's like to live in an uncertain world, the social structures within which you live won't forget. And I think that's the key, is to have social institutions that overcome our own forgetfulness about how bad life can be in the face of really uncertain events. I hope that's a reasonably responsive answer. It's a deep and difficult question.
Oh, well, you clarified that perfectly. Thank you for that. That was also something I was very curious about myself. Our next question is, unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be our last question. Do you think that the human desire for efficiency has or will be decreasing in the future due to a culture shift, as there seems to be increasing apathy towards work culture?
I don't know the answer to that. Here, the great unknown in my mind is whether the incredible transformation that we are seeing, what is it called? It's called, in the States, they call it the Great Resignation. It's like people are just deciding, I've been spending all my life pursuing the wrong stuff, and the pandemic has taught me what's really important. And they're sort of giving the finger to everything that were trained to care about. Fine. Is this going to last more than 5 minutes? Who the hell knows? I don't know. It looks like we've really changed how people think about what the trajectory of their lives should be. But I have no confidence that our memory for this is going to be, any longer than our memory for anything else. I don't know if this varied from country to country, but when the pandemic first started in the US, in various cities at 7:00 at night or something like that, people would open their windows and applaud all of the essential workers who were putting their lives at risk in order to help us. The people who were supplying groceries, and obviously people who were working in healthcare facilities. So these are all people doing jobs that were invisible. And the pandemic made them visible. And we all celebrated them. So how long is that going to last? Are people going to raise the salaries of these invisible people so that they're making a living wage on all by themselves by working a full work week? I kind of doubt it. I kind of expect that things are going to slowly recede to where they were pre-pandemic, unless we do something structural that builds our current appreciation of what the role that these people play in our lives into the day-to-day fabric of society. So your guess is as good as mine about whether this transformation is just a blip or a real indication that we are collectively changing our direction. It's hard to be optimistic that it's more than a blip, and I'll probably be dead before we know. But I'm rooting for it to be more than a blip, because I have grandchildren who I want to live in a better world than the one that they were born into.
Well, I do hope we have a
realistic answer to your question.
Yes, you answered that perfectly. I agree with you. I think all we can do is really hope and put our best foot forward in that we would continue to appreciate all the people that have become seen due to the COVID pandemic.
We can do a little more than hope. We can work to put structures in place that will embody our current way of thinking even after we forget. That, I think, it's better than hope. You produce social transformations that institutionalize the impulses that we currently have, because we're going to forget. You can't trust us, but you can, to some degree, trust the institutions that we have developed to take advantage of the lessons we've learned from these very hard times. So it's in your hands. It's not in my hands. It's in the hands of people much younger than me.
I couldn't agree more. It was such a privilege to have you here today, Professor. The link you made between economics and psychology and your entire speech was incredibly inspiring and very insightful. So I would like to thank you sincerely for your time and for this Q&A session. It was extremely captivating.
Thank you. People in the audience, I very much appreciate your attendance, and I hope the whole conference is great for you.
Thank you.